On March 14, 2026, a senior Iranian official told CNN that Iran is considering allowing a limited number of oil tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, provided that the oil cargo is traded in Chinese yuan rather than U.S. dollars. Read that sentence again. The country that controls 20% of the world's oil transit has told the world it will let oil through, but only if you stop using the American dollar to pay for it. That is not a trade policy. That is a declaration of war on the currency that has underwritten every element of American financial power for 52 years. And it is not theoretical. It is already happening. Indian refiners are settling Russian crude purchases in Chinese yuan and UAE dirhams, bypassing the dollar entirely, according to Bloomberg. In March 2026, Saudi Aramco shipped 58 million barrels to China, a multi-year high, with an increasing portion of those transactions settled in yuan. Iran is charging yuan-denominated transit tolls for tankers passing through the strait. Asian reinsurance pools are now quoting war risk premiums in yuan rather than dollars. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps closed the strait to vessels linked to the United States, Israel, and their Western allies. But for India, Turkey, and China, the waterway remains navigable provided the right currency is tendered. Deutsche Bank published a note to clients warning that __, quote _0, __. And Brad Setzer at the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the most respected analysts of cross-border capital flows in the world, published an analysis 5 days ago with a headline that would have been unthinkable 18 months ago. He wrote that, quote, one, and the reason most Americans have no idea this is happening is that the petrodollar system was never taught in schools, never explained on the evening news, and never described in the language that ordinary people use to understand why their dollar buys what it buys. So I am going to explain it from the beginning. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the death of the petrodollar is the most consequential financial event of your lifetime, and why every mortgage rate, every grocery bill, every gas price, and every retirement account in America is connected to a 52-year-old deal between Richard Nixon and the King of Saudi Arabia that is unraveling in real time on a waterway that most Americans cannot find on a map. The 1974 deal that wired the entire global economy to the American dollar, and why you never heard about it. In 1974, following the OPEC oil embargo that brought the American economy to its knees, the United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia that would become the invisible foundation of American financial supremacy for the next half-century. The terms were elegant in their simplicity and devastating in their reach. Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exports in U.S. dollars and to invest its surplus oil revenue in U.S. Treasury securities and other American financial assets. In exchange, the United States guaranteed Saudi Arabia's security, including stationing troops in the region, providing advanced weapons systems, and ensuring free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. That deal was never codified in a formal treaty. There is no signed document in a vault somewhere that says the Petrodollar Agreement. It was an understanding reinforced by decades of practice, diplomacy, and mutual benefit that became so deeply embedded in the structure of global trade that most people forgot it was a choice. It simply became the way things were. And the way things were was this. Because Saudi Arabia priced its oil in dollars, every country on earth that needed to buy oil, which is every country on earth, needed dollars to buy it. That created permanent, structural, global demand for the U.S. dollar that existed independent of the strength of the American economy. Japan needed dollars to buy Saudi oil. Germany needed dollars to buy Saudi oil. India needed dollars. China needed dollars. Brazil needed dollars. And because they all needed dollars, they all held dollars in reserve. And because they held dollars in reserve, they invested those reserves in U.S. Treasury securities, which funded the American government's deficit spending at artificially low interest rates. And because interest rates were artificially low, Americans could borrow cheaply to buy houses, cars, education, and consumer goods. The entire American standard of living for the past 50 years was subsidized, in part, by a currency arrangement that forced the rest of the world to fund American consumption. French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. And the privilege was not small. Economists estimate that the reserve currency status saved the American government between 50 and 100 basis points on every Treasury bond issued, which on a national debt exceeding $36 trillion translates to savings of $180 billion to $360 billion per year in interest costs alone. That savings was passed to every American consumer in lower mortgage rates, lower auto loan rates, and lower corporate borrowing costs. The privilege also allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits without the currency collapse that would punish any other country. When Japan runs a trade deficit, the yen weakens. When America runs one, the dollar holds because structural demand from oil-buying countries provides a floor. That floor has allowed the United States to import more than it exports every year since 1975, paying for the difference by issuing debt the world is incentivized to buy because they need the currency it is denominated in. The circularity is breathtaking. The world buys American debt to hold the dollars it needs to buy oil. America uses the cheap debt to fund government spending. Americans use the borrowed money to buy imports. The payment flows back to countries that buy more debt. The loop has fed itself for 52 years, until now. And Deutsche Bank's recent note explained why the privilege was so durable. Oil is a core input to global manufacturing and transport. Supply chains have a natural incentive to dollarize when the underlying commodity is priced in dollars. Mideast oil and gas are used to make petrochemicals, fertilizer, and even helium, which is critical to chip making. The dollar's dominance in cross-border trade was built on the petrodollar. And the petrodollar was built on a handshake between Richard Nixon's Treasury Secretary and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And that handshake is now being broken by a war that the United States started. Saudi Arabia quietly ended the exclusive dollar arrangement in June 2024, and nobody in America noticed. In June 2024, Saudi Arabia effectively ended its exclusive commitment to pricing oil in dollars. Fortune reported that the kingdom, quote, There was no press conference, no formal announcement, no state dinner where the cancellation was acknowledged. The 50-year arrangement simply expired and was not renewed. And Saudi Arabia had already been building the technical infrastructure for alternatives. The kingdom established a $7 billion currency swap agreement with China, giving it the mechanical ability to settle oil transactions in yuan without converting through dollars. Saudi Arabia joined the mBridge cross-border settlement platform, a digital payment system developed by the central banks of China, Thailand, the UAE, and Hong Kong, designed specifically to enable international trade settlement outside the dollar system. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS in 2024, aligning itself with a bloc that now includes China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE, a bloc that collectively represents over 40% of the world's population and approximately 30% of global GDP. And the BRICS nations have been building alternative payment infrastructure for years. China has established yuan swap lines with over 40 central banks around the world. Russia has shifted the majority of its energy trade with China to yuan settlement. India has experimented with non-dollar payment arrangements for its sanctioned trading partners. The infrastructure for a post-dollar oil market was being built while Americans were watching Netflix and scrolling social media and being told by the financial press that de-dollarization was a fantasy that would never happen because the dollar was too deeply embedded in global trade to be replaced. That assessment was correct in the sense that no single currency can replace the dollar overnight. It was catastrophically wrong in the sense that it assumed the system would remain unchanged indefinitely. And Trump himself inadvertently accelerated the de-dollarization trend when he threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS nations attempting to replace the dollar, declaring in February 2025 that BRICS is dead. The Peterson Institute for International Economics projected that such tariffs would harm both the U.S. and targeted economies through slower growth and higher inflation. The threat did not kill BRICS. It reinforced the conviction among BRICS members that the United States would weaponize the dollar against anyone who tried to leave the dollar system, which made the case for leaving the dollar system even stronger. When the cost of staying in a system is that the system's operator punishes you for looking at alternatives, the rational response is to build the alternatives faster and more quietly. And that is exactly what happened throughout 2024 and 2025. Quietly, below the radar of American media. While the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and Deutsche Bank were publishing detailed analyses of the petroyuan infrastructure, American cable news was covering election polls and celebrity scandals. The most consequential financial restructuring since Bretton Woods was happening in plain sight, documented by every major financial institution on Earth, and the American public was not informed because the story is too complex for a 90-second news segment and too alarming for a political establishment that depends on the status quo. The system has changed, And the change accelerated dramatically the moment the United States and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran on February 28, 2026, and Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz and offering passage to anyone willing to pay in yuan. The Iran war turned the Strait of Hormuz into a yuan toll booth, and the dollar's monopoly shattered in 6 weeks. The genius of Iran's response to the U.S.-Israeli strikes was not military. It was financial. Instead of simply closing the Strait of Hormuz and letting the world suffer equally, Iran weaponized the strait as a currency sorting mechanism. Chinese tankers were allowed to pass. Ships willing to settle in yuan were given access. Ships linked to the United States, Israel, and Western allies were blocked. The IRGC effectively turned the most important oil transit choke point on Earth into a yuan toll booth. And the strategic elegance of this move is difficult to overstate. By offering access to the strait in exchange for yuan settlement, Iran created an immediate, tangible, survival-level incentive for every oil-importing nation on Earth to acquire yuan instead of dollars. When your refineries are running low and your economy depends on imported crude, you do not care about the abstract geopolitics of currency sovereignty. You care about getting oil through the strait. And if the price of getting oil through the strait is paying in yuan instead of dollars, you pay in yuan. India did. Indian refiners began settling Russian crude purchases in yuan and UAE dirhams, bypassing the dollar entirely, according to Bloomberg. Turkey did, China obviously did, and the insurance markets adapted in real time. Lloyd's of London syndicates raised war risk premiums for Persian Gulf voyages to 7.5% of hull value, up from 0.05% before the conflict. But the more structurally significant development was that several Asian reinsurance pools began quoting premiums in yuan rather than dollars. The insurance infrastructure itself, which is the backbone of global shipping, started de-dollarizing because the underlying risk was now denominated in a non-dollar geography. An energy analyst at Chatham House was quoted saying that the Hormuz blockade just unplugged the machine being the petrodollar recycling system that had operated continuously for 52 years. And Asia Times published an analysis from a professor of economics at Paragon International University in Cambodia arguing that Iran's Hormuz yuan play was, quote, 7, and that while the dollar is not about to be dethroned overnight, an Iranian yuan for Hormuz policy would not create a new direction in global finance so much as accelerate an existing one. And the numbers confirm the acceleration. About 20% of global oil trade was already being conducted in currencies other than the dollar as of 2023, according to the Geopolitical Economy Report. That was a marked shift compared to previous years when the dollar's share was above 95%, but it still meant 80% of oil was dollar-denominated. The Iran war is compressing what would have been another decade of gradual erosion into a matter of months. Brent crude reached $108.01 per barrel on March 27th, up more than 40% since the war began. The $12.45 Brent WTI spread reflected the acute premium global buyers are paying for waterborne crude while Middle East shipping lanes remain contested, and some ships are claiming to have commercial links to China even when they do not, simply to gain passage through the strait. The desperation to access oil supply is overriding every other consideration, including currency loyalty. When a country's refineries are running dry and its economy is shutting down, the currency denomination of its oil purchase is not a matter of geopolitical principle. It is a matter of survival, and survival economics always wins over institutional loyalty. That is why the petrodollar, which survived 50 years of geopolitical tension when the tension was abstract, is cracking in 6 weeks of physical supply disruption. Abstract threats are manageable. Empty refineries are not. The acceleration is the key word. The de-dollarization trend existed before February 28th. It was gradual. It was manageable. It was something that economists could discuss at conferences and policymakers could defer to the next administration. The Iran war compressed decades of gradual drift into 6 weeks of structural rupture. And the rupture is visible in a single number. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves, which was 71% in 1999, has fallen to approximately 57% according to EBC Financial Group, a 14-point decline, and the decline has accelerated noticeably since the Iran crisis began. Gulf states stopped recycling petrodollars into treasuries, and that is why your interest rates are high. Here is the part that connects the geopolitics to your mortgage payment. For 50 years, the petrodollar system worked on a loop. The world bought oil in dollars. The oil-producing states accumulated dollars. They reinvested those dollars in U.S. Treasury securities. That reinvestment created massive demand for treasuries, which kept Treasury yields low. And because mortgage rates, corporate bond rates, student loan rates, and every other borrowing cost in America is priced off Treasury yields, the petrodollar recycling loop kept the cost of borrowing artificially low for American households and businesses. That loop is breaking. Analysis published in Open Politics documented that Gulf nations have stopped recycling dollars into U.S. treasuries and are instead moving toward what analysts call petroequities, investing in global tech stocks like Nvidia and Apple, in Chinese equities, and in domestic infrastructure projects funded through direct yuan transactions with Chinese construction firms. Saudi Aramco shipped 58 million barrels to China in March, with an increasing portion settled in yuan to fund Saudi infrastructure projects with Chinese firms. Brad Setzer at the Council on Foreign Relations confirmed this shift in his analysis 5 days ago, noting that prior to the confrontation with Iran and the interruption of oil flow through Hormuz, there was almost no flow from the oil exporters into liquid dollar assets. The Saudis are not generating a big surplus to reinforce the petrodollar system with oil at around $100. Not when their balance of payments break even on approximately 7 million barrels per day of exports is over $90 per barrel. The surplus that used to flood into treasuries and keep American interest rates low is either non-existent or being directed into non-dollar assets. And the consequences are already visible in the bond market. The 10-year Treasury yield jumped to 4.46% on March 27th. The 30-year mortgage rate climbed to 6.38% on March 26th. The U.S. government now spends more on interest payments, over $1 trillion per year, than it spends on its entire defense budget. Open Politics described it as a fiscal treadmill where the government must borrow just to pay the interest on what it already borrowed. And the reduced demand from oil producers exerts constant upward pressure on interest rates because if the UAE or Saudi Arabia are not forced to buy treasuries to park their oil wealth, the U.S. must compete with the rest of the world for capital. And competing for capital means paying higher yields. And paying higher yields means higher mortgage rates, higher credit card rates, higher auto loan rates, and higher costs for every American who borrows money for any reason. The petrodollar subsidized American borrowing for 50 years. That subsidy is ending, and the cost of its absence is showing up in the interest rate on your next mortgage application, your next car loan, your next credit card statement, and the interest payments on a national debt that is approaching $36 trillion. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen 14 points in 25 years, and the war just accelerated the decline. EBC Financial Group analyst Michael Harris documented that the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has reached a 25-year low, falling from 71% in 1999 to roughly 57% today. That 14-point decline represents trillions of dollars in reserve holdings that central banks around the world have moved out of dollar-denominated assets and into alternatives. Gold is the primary beneficiary. Central banks in China, India, Russia, Turkey, and Poland have been buying gold at record quantities for 4 consecutive years. The price of gold has crossed $4,500 per ounce, approximately triple what it was just a few years ago. That price is not speculation. It is the collective judgment of the world's central banks that the dollar is no longer the sole reliable store of value. And the BRICS nations have been the primary drivers of the shift. Russia now settles the majority of its energy trade with China in yuan. Russia's preference for yuan over Indian rupees reveals a structural reality. Moscow runs a massive trade surplus with India, but rupees have limited international purchasing power. Yuan converts to rubles in a single step and purchases Chinese goods directly. China has established the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, as a direct alternative to the Western-dominated SWIFT system. CIPS processed over $14 trillion in transactions in 2024. And the mBridge platform, which Saudi Arabia joined, is designed to enable central banks to settle cross-border transactions directly in local currencies without converting through the dollar. Each of these systems, CIPS, mBridge, bilateral swap lines, BRICS payment infrastructure, is a bypass around the dollar. No single bypass replaces the dollar, but collectively they create a network of alternatives that reduces the world's structural dependency on the dollar for trade settlement. And every reduction in structural dependency reduces the demand for dollars, which reduces the demand for treasuries, which raises treasury yields, which raises American borrowing costs. The mechanism is invisible to the ordinary American, but the outcome is not. The outcome is the interest rate on your mortgage. The outcome is the price of imported goods. The outcome is the inflation rate. The outcome is the purchasing power of the cash in your savings account. And the shift is not limited to oil trade settlement. It extends to the entire architecture of global finance. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, processed over $14 trillion in transactions in 2024, providing a complete alternative to the SWIFT messaging system that the United States has repeatedly weaponized through sanctions. When the U.S. cut Russia off from SWIFT in 2022, it demonstrated to every non-allied nation on Earth that the dollar-based financial infrastructure could be turned against them at any time for political reasons. That demonstration was the single most powerful catalyst for CIPS adoption because it proved that the cost of dollar dependency was not just economic, it was existential. Any country that relies exclusively on dollar-denominated trade and SWIFT-based settlement is one sanctions decision away from being economically paralyzed. And the countries that learned that lesson, China, Russia, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Brazil, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, are collectively building the bypass infrastructure that will make the next round of sanctions less effective. Each bypass reduces the coercive power of the dollar. Each reduction in coercive power reduces the incentive to hold dollars. And each reduction in dollar holdings reduces the demand for treasuries. And the outcome is getting worse because the trend is accelerating and the Iran war just gave it the most powerful catalyst in a generation. The security guarantee that kept the petrodollar alive for 50 years just demonstrated its failure in real time. The petrodollar deal was never just about currency. It was about security. Saudi Arabia priced oil in dollars because the United States guaranteed Saudi security. The security guarantee was demonstrated in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia. The United States assembled a massive international coalition, defeated Iraq in a matter of weeks, restored Kuwait's sovereignty, and stabilized oil prices. That demonstration told every oil-producing nation in the Gulf that the American security umbrella was real and that pricing oil in dollars was a small price to pay for the protection it provided. The 2026 Iran war has delivered the opposite demonstration. The United States and Israel launched strikes on Iran on February 28th. Iran retaliated with missile and drone strikes on U.S. and Israeli targets and, critically, on Gulf states hosting U.S. forces. Saudi Arabia's largest refinery was targeted. Qatar's LNG export facilities were hit. Kuwait's infrastructure was attacked. The UAE faced drone strikes. The Strait of Hormuz was closed. And the American security umbrella that was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario failed to prevent it. Deutsche Bank noted that damage to Gulf economies could encourage an unwind in their foreign asset savings, meaning Gulf states that have accumulated hundreds of billions in dollar-denominated financial assets may begin liquidating those assets to fund domestic reconstruction and economic stabilization. Fortune reported that Saudi Arabia, historically Washington's most critical Middle Eastern ally, now sits within BRICS and participates in mBridge. Gulf states' efforts to diversify from oil and become international finance and tourism hubs are at risk amid the Iranian bombardment. And the message that the war has sent to every oil-producing nation in the Gulf is stark. The United States cannot protect you from Iran. The deal you made in 1974, trading dollar-denominated oil for American security, has a hole in it. The security failed, and if the security failed, the rationale for the dollar pricing is weaker than it has been at any point since the deal was struck. Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadin said at Davos that the Riyal dollar peg is not under discussion. Saudi Arabia's central bank governor said the peg ___12__. Those statements carry weight. They signal that Riyadh is not about to abandon the dollar overnight, but the structural conditions for a gradual, irreversible shift away from exclusive dollar pricing have never been stronger than they are right now in April of 2026, with the strait still blocked, the refineries still damaged, the war still unresolved, and the yuan toll booth still operating at the most important oil choke point on Earth. And Iran's five-point counterproposal to the U.S. ceasefire terms included a demand for international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. If that demand is met in any future negotiation, it would formalize Tehran's leverage over global oil transit permanently, giving one country the legal authority to determine which currencies are accepted for passage through the world's most important energy choke point. That is not a temporary wartime measure, that is a permanent restructuring of the global energy architecture. And even if the demand is not formally met, the precedent has been set. Iran demonstrated that physical control of a maritime choke point can be weaponized to reshape currency markets. Every government on Earth with access to a strategic waterway, the Malacca Strait through which 25% of global trade passes, the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb, is now aware that waterway control is currency leverage. The lesson of the Hormuz blockade will not be forgotten by any of them, and the Gulf states are drawing their own conclusions. The UAE has been rapidly diversifying its economy away from oil dependency through massive investments in tourism, finance, technology, and renewable energy, precisely because the long-term reliability of the American security guarantee has been in question since at least 2019, when the U.S. failed to respond forcefully to Iranian drone attacks on Saudi Aramco facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais that temporarily knocked out 5.7 million barrels per day of Saudi production. That 2019 incident was a dress rehearsal for what happened in 2026, and the lesson the Gulf states learned from the dress rehearsal was that the American security umbrella has holes in it, and that the prudent response is not to leave the umbrella, but to make sure you have alternative arrangements in case the umbrella fails again. The alternative arrangements include the 7 billion yuan swap with China, the mBridge membership, the BRICS participation, the direct yuan settlement with Chinese firms, and the diversification of sovereign wealth fund investments away from treasuries and into global equities and non-dollar assets. Each of these is a hedge against the possibility that the petrodollar system is no longer reliable enough to bet a kingdom on, and collectively they represent the most significant reorientation of Gulf financial strategy since the 1974 deal itself. The petrodollar is not dying in a single dramatic event, it is dying in the gap between what the security guarantee promised and what it delivered, and that gap as of this week is wider than it has ever been. And the speed at which the gap is widening is itself a signal that the process may be irreversible. When a 52-year-old currency arrangement begins to crack, the question is whether the cracks can be repaired or whether they have reached the point where the structure is no longer sound. The answer depends on whether the conditions that created the cracks are temporary or permanent. The Iran war may be temporary, but the infrastructure that BRICS built, the mBridge platform, CEPs, the yuan swap lines, the gold accumulation, the non-dollar settlement mechanisms, all of that is permanent. It was built to survive the end of the crisis that inspired it. And it will be used long after the war is over, long after the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, and long after the headlines have moved on to the next emergency. The petrodollar system that kept American interest rates low, American imports cheap, and the American government funded at discount rates for 52 years is being replaced piece by piece by a multipolar financial architecture that does not require the dollar. And most Americans have no idea, not because the information is hidden, but because no one has explained it in language that makes the connection between a currency swap agreement in Riyadh and the interest rate on your next mortgage payment. That connection is real. It is direct, it is measurable, and it is the most important economic story of the decade. And almost nobody is telling you.